So, as we move forward into our discussion of the Infinity Gauntlet and Warlock and the Infinity Watch, which of course is the event that takes place immediately after the Infinity Gauntlet, I felt like it was important to do a lead up to this discussion by talking about various characters. Now, this first discussion is about the One Above All, and while the One Above All doesn't necessarily appear in the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, the Living Tribunal does. But in order to understand the role that the Living Tribunal plays in the Marvel Multiverse, we have to talk about the One Above All so we can have some context and understand why the Living Tribunal does what he does. So the One Above All is an extremely obscure character in Marvel Comics. In fact, the evidence that I've uncovered, all the investigation that I've done, has pointed to the fact that the One Above All has only appeared, whether by discussion or direct appearances, 17 times in the entire publication history of Marvel Comics, which is an extremely small number. It's an extraordinarily small number, especially when you consider the idea that characters like Wolverine have appeared in over 13,000 different comics. So the One Above All, I guess, really first appears, or at the very least is first mentioned, in Doctor Strange Volume 2, issue number 13. And what we see going on here is that Eternity had previously been captured by Doctor Strange's nemesis, Nightmare. Now, Nightmare is, of course, one of the various nemesis that Doctor Strange faces that hails from a different dimension. And like all of the other, foes that Doctor Strange has that exist in different dimensions, Nightmare is strongest in his own dream dimension. And this is where Doctor Strange has traveled. What we see is that Doctor Strange is able to free Eternity from a capsule that is keeping him captive at the hands of Nightmare, and Eternity gives us a little bit of explanation on who he is, gives us a little bit of explanation on what his character is about. Now, this is not the first time that Eternity appears in Marvel Comics, but it does again give us a refresher course just because he's not a character that appears very often. Then what Eternity tells us is that he is but one version of himself. He is simply the version of Eternity that's confined to this universe. For every universe that exists, there's an Eternity for that universe. And Eternity refers to the One Above All by simply referring to him as God. And all Eternity tells us here with regards to the One Above All is that he's not God, that Eternity exists only in this reality, but that God rules all realities. Now, I would like you to pay very close attention to this because this is actually an instance where Marvel will simply just use the phrase God. And it's not really a term that we will see them use too much longer. What we actually see is we jump forward to the 1990s, which is about 20 years or so after his first appearance in Doctor Strange Volume 2, issue number 13. And keep in mind, of course, we're skipping over a few discussions here and there, but what we see around 1992 is Warlock and the Infinity Watch, issue number 1. Now, to keep from spoiling the end of the Infinity Gauntlet, although I think it's pretty popular knowledge at this point, we see that Adam Warlock is standing trial before the Living Tribunal as well as all the other cosmic entities due to his actions during the Infinity Gauntlet storyline. And what's really kind of cool about this is Adam Warlock actually flies into a fit of rage and uses the power of the Infinity Gauntlet against the cosmic entities. But then we see the Living Tribunal simply says, "Let there be order in the court," and he snaps his fingers and all of Adam Warlock's power goes away, which of course indicates to us that the Living Tribunal has power that vastly supersedes anything that any of the Infinity Gauntlets could possibly wield, because for each universe that exists, there's an Infinity Gauntlet for that universe. And of course, this was something that was specified to us during Hickman's run of Fantastic Four with the Council of Reeds and so on. But what we see is that the Living Tribunal simply says that he is a representative of forces, or of a force that dwarfs the power of the Infinity Gauntlet of Adam Warlock. And this is all we get. Now from here we jump to the Infinity War issue number 2. And the Infinity War is actually a discussion that we're not really going to go into while we're talking about the Infinity Gauntlet, just because this ends up in a sort of crazy kind of scenario, and a sort of crazy thing where we have you have like Paradise Omega, and you have Goddess, and you have the Magus, and there's all kinds of crazy things that go on here, and it would be a very in-depth and extremely long discussion. But what we see here for the most part is that Warlock and a multitude of Earthbound heroes access something called the Infinity Well, and the Infinity Well exists inside the domain of Mistress Death, and it's a source of infinite knowledge, but only for those individuals that are able to ask the right questions. And the Infinity Well simply just rehashes the trial of Adam Warlock before the Living Tribunal, where he was being held accountable for his actions during the Infinity Gauntlet storyline. And what we see is the first time that the One Above All is actually referred to as the One Above All. But what the Infinity Well refers to it as is the One who is above all. And for the most part, this is how we will see the One Above All addressed from this point going forward. Now, one of the more interesting concepts when it comes to the One Above All is actually during Fantastic Four Volume 1, issue number 511. And what we see is that there were a set of incidents that took place whereby Ben Grimm was presumed to have been killed and had traveled to heaven. And we saw that the remainders of the Fantastic Four, Reed Richards, Susan Storm, and Johnny Storm, traveled to heaven in an attempt to bring Ben Grimm back. And what we see is that over the course of this entire series, that they end up in heaven proper. They end up in the domain of the One Above All. And when they actually open the door to the, to where the One Above All resides, that the One Above All is revealed to be Jack Kirby. Now, this is really kind of funny here, just because I doubt that Mark Waid really intended for us to actually believe that the One Above All is Jack Kirby. But this is also really kind of interesting at the same time, because for the most part, there's really no reason to say that it's not. Jack Kirby was by many considered to be the creator of a lot of superheroes, of the Fantastic Four, of Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, and so on. He was the godfather of a lot of these characters, and Stan Lee was simply the one that wrote the stories. And so for a lot of people, it was an entertaining sort of analogy. It was an entertaining sort of concept. And of course, Jack Kirby simply talks to Reed Richards for a few minutes about how the world, or how the universe, the multiverse exists. And what he really sort of indicates to us here is that he simply just set things in motion. He doesn't exactly know how they're going to turn out. But again, this is actually kind of contradicted later on when we learn about the abilities of the One Above All, one of which includes, or I guess several of which include omniscience and omnipotence. But from here, we actually jump to Sensational Spider-Man issue number 40. And this, in my personal opinion, is the best story involving the One Above All, because this is actually part of a four-part story, I think, called One More Day, where Aunt May is shot due to a failed assassination attempt on Peter Parker. And what we see is that, of course, Peter Parker is dealing with this kind of fallout, I guess, this kind of languish due to the fact that Aunt May very well die, who is, of course, a major figure in his life. And what we see is that Peter Parker, in a fit of rage, punches a dumpster. When he punches the dumpster, he's sort of agonizing over his actions, and then an individual simply just responds behind him by saying that the dumpster will never menace anyone again. From here, we see that Peter Parker turns around, and he simply just sees a homeless man standing there, and the homeless man says that he's really not looking for any kind of trouble. What we see is that Peter Parker's kind of shocked here, because this individual was able to sneak up on him without Peter Parker's spider sense going off, which is something that really shouldn't have happened. But we also see is that this homeless man tries to tell Peter Parker that he wants to talk to him, that he wants to buy him food. And of course, he refers to Peter Parker by name. Now, Peter Parker sort of blows this off. He, of course, talks about how Peter Parker has been in various news magazines and so on, especially after Peter Parker had revealed himself to be Spider-Man, which had led to the assassination attempt on him. And of course, we see that the One Above All tells Peter Parker that he's sorry about his hands. His hands are bloody and they're damaged. And then we see that this homeless man heals Peter Parker's hands. Peter Parker is surprised to see this, and he turns and asks the individual, "Who are you?" He doesn't quite know who he is. And this individual responds by simply saying that Peter Parker knows who he is. And at this point, we see, I guess, a sort of demonstration of the powers that the One Above All possesses, where he simply just flashes, makes himself a very bright light, and Peter Parker realizes that this is the One Above All. Now, whether or not this is simply Peter Parker just realizing this, and I guess maybe having always had a gut feeling that this person was the god of the Marvel Multiverse, or because this individual, the One Above All, has simply just given Peter Parker this knowledge, is not something that's explained to us. We're just kind of left to interpret that on our own. But what we see is that Peter Parker, in effect, has a conversation with God. And of course, the first question that he asks is probably the question that any one of us would ask if we were faced with a scenario where we had a loved one that's dying and the opportunity to speak directly with God. What he says is that he's supposed to be omnipotent, that he can do anything. And so the question is, why can't he simply just heal Aunt May? Why can't he simply just make it so that Aunt May won't die? And of course, the One Above All responds that if you were to give him an answer to that question, would Peter Parker, what would he do? Peter Parker sort of under this impression that maybe Aunt May dying is some sort of grand scheme, that maybe there's some sort of bigger picture going on here that Peter Parker is quite not quite aware of. But what we see is that, of course, as Peter Parker begs and Peter Parker asks the One Above All to spare Aunt May, the One Above All asks, "What would you do to have this happen? Would you give up being Spider-Man? Would you give up everything in your life in order for her to live?" And Peter Parker says yes. He says, of course, that's something that he would do. He actually goes as far as to ask the One Above All, would he rewrite Peter Parker's entire story so that somebody else was bitten by a spider and Peter Parker never had to deal with any of this in the first place? The One Above All pauses for a second and then tells Peter Parker that he wants to take him somewhere. And what we see is that Peter Parker is taken to Robert Moses Beach by the One Above All, which is a place where Peter Parker had spent his youth with his Uncle Ben and Aunt May, where he used to play and so on and so forth. Peter Parker reminisces on the fact that they would drive there every Sunday, and of course Peter Parker would spend time bathing in the water and enjoying the sun and so on and so forth. And what we see is that the One Above All and Peter Parker begin to take a walk down the boardwalk. At this point, the One Above All tells Peter Parker that the suffering of people is a mysterious thing to him. The suffering of people is something that he's really just not quite able to grasp. And this is really interesting to us because what this tells us is that this version, this sort of God that exists in the Marvel multiverse is not a parallel to the Judeo-Christian God, where in Judeo-Christianity, God is a loving God, depending on which what sort of God you choose to believe in. But he's a loving God that loves humans as though they were his own children, which according to Judeo-Christianity, that is the case. But this version of God is simply just the individual that set everything in motion. And while I wouldn't go as far as to say that he is emotionally detached from humanity, he doesn't necessarily understand humanity, which of course begs the question, is he the one responsible for creating humanity? And I would say the answer to this question is probably no. That what happened is the One Above All had simply just, I guess, maybe lit a spark, or had simply just initiated the Big Bang that led to the creation of everything, which would lead to the destruction of universes, the creation of new universes, and so on and so forth. And that that humanity as a whole, that all the species and all the races that exist in the Marvel multiverse are simply just a byproduct of the evolutionary process of the universe playing out its role, following its own course. But what we see is that the One Above All reveals to Peter Parker all the people that Peter Parker had ever saved, all the individuals that have lived because of him. He really talks about how Peter Parker had entered and left their lives, sometimes within minutes, sometimes within seconds. Maybe it was simply just swinging by and saving a child from being hit by a car, or maybe it was his involvement in a more in-depth storyline whereby he sought out to save a specific individual. But that all these individuals here are people that are either individuals who were saved directly or people whose lives were bettered because of the fact that their loved ones were saved. Peter Parker is actually surprised by this. He doesn't realize that all these individuals here, that this small sampling of individuals that are there, are people that he's saved. And he's actually sort of, he expresses gratitude to the One Above All for this, to really sort of get an idea of the magnitude of all the good that he's done in his life. But in the end, it doesn't assuage his conscience. It doesn't make him any less angry, and it doesn't make the suffering go away. And the One Above All recognizes this. The One Above All actually goes as far as to tell Peter Parker that he recognizes that it doesn't make his suffering go away. And then we see the One Above All sort of explaining to Peter Parker why it is that things are the way they are, why it is that Aunt May is teetering on the edge of life and death. He tells Peter Parker that everybody has a role to play, that everybody has a part to play, which may include the One Above All itself, and that maybe at some point along the line, the One Above All may die. We're not exactly sure what the case may be here, but what we see is that the One Above All says to Peter Parker that this is his role, that this is his lot in life, that the actions that will take place here, the concept that Aunt May very well die, will go towards him being defined as a more in-depth character character will go towards him, I guess maybe establishing himself as a more serious individual, much in the same way that the death of Gwen Stacy had led to Peter Parker understanding that I guess maybe that it wasn't enough to simply just save people, that the death of Aunt May lead him down a different path. The death of Aunt May lead him down a more serious road, or it could lead him down a more serious, I guess, sinister road where he would become a villain. But what we see is, of course, that Peter Parker, I guess, begins to break down and tells the One Above All that he just doesn't want Aunt May to die. That's the only real thing he wants. That at the end of the day, he's really not all that concerned about the thousands of people that he's saved. They make him feel good, but in the end, all he really wants is for his Aunt May to stay alive. And the One Above All's last few words to Peter Parker is to simply just have faith. From here, we get this sort of, I guess maybe montage where we see that the possible future, or the most likely future that will take place with Peter Parker, is Peter Parker growing old with Mary Jane, and of course the two of them having children, Benjamin and Mary. And as far as I understand, this is actually the last appearance that we'll see, or at the very least that we have seen up until the current day, of the One Above All. I do not believe there have been any other appearances involving his character. Now, in terms of his relation to the Living Tribunal, what we know is that at some point along the line, the Living Tribunal had to be created, because there had to be somebody that could oversee the balance of multiverses, the balance of universes. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and lead in with the next video, and we'll talk about the Living Tribunal. We'll talk about the role that the Living Tribunal plays, and why it is that the Living Tribunal is so significant to the Marvel Multiverse. And I would even go as far as to say that the Living Tribunal is actually more significant to the Marvel Multiverse than the One Above All.